Hello and welcome to a video tutorial that should help you revise for your history midterm test. The topic is prehistory. In the video I'm going to quickly go through pretty much all the topics that will enter in the test. Please try and answer the questions I ask as I go along and stop the video if you need to, because this way you'll actually be learning actively. Okay, so first topic, prehistory versus history. What is the difference? Hopefully you remember that pre, this part of the word, means, you should be answering now in your own head, before. Therefore, prehistory is the time before history. But how do we separate these two things? Simply with an event. And this event is, again, try and answer, the invention of writing. Perhaps you even know the year that writing was invented. If you do, say it now, and if not, maybe stop the video and look it up. Writing was invented in the year around 3500 BC in Mesopotamia, which will be the next topic we're going to study. So, the invention of writing in 3500 BC is what separates prehistory from history. Therefore, all the time in prehistory means that the people could not write, and therefore they could not read either. So perhaps you wonder, if the people couldn't read or write, how can we know anything about this time period? Well, that's where professionals called archaeologists come in. They're people that study fossils and artifacts. If you don't remember, an artifact is like an object, a historical object. So the archaeologists excavate, dig up and find fossils, artifacts, things like that, and study them to know about the past. Therefore, archaeologists would be essential for us to learn about prehistory. And then in history is all the time after the invention of writing. So it's from around the year 3500 BC until now, and will continue on into the future. If written records now exist, which means anything written down on paper, a letter, a book, a note, things like that, if those things exist, written records, it means that professionals who study the past have more information to work with. And the type of person who studies these written records is called an historian. So if I ask you in the test, what professional works or studies which time period, the answer should be that an archaeologist studies prehistory and a historian studies history, because archaeologists study artifacts, which there are many of from prehistory, whilst historians study written records. Hopefully you also notice that an archaeologist could also study history, because there are also artifacts in history, okay? They can work together. However, a historian is not going to study written records from prehistory because they don't exist. They could write a book about the artifacts found. And so here we have an example of a historic written record, okay? One of the earliest forms of writing on a clay tablet that the historians would study. Okay, so by now you should know what's prehistory, all the time before the invention of writing, and what's history, all the time after the invention of writing. The two professionals that study these periods, archaeologists and historians. The things archaeologists study, artifacts, and the things historians study, written records. Now we're going to talk about the proportionality of time. I need you to understand just how vast time is and just how little of that time has been taken up by history. So we can show it in many ways. For example, I could draw like a timeline. Now you should use a ruler so that it's nice and straight. And if I wanted to show prehistory and history on this timeline, all of this section, okay, all of this, even more in fact, would be, hopefully you can answer, prehistory. And that tiny bit at the end would be history. Why? Because prehistory is all the time before the invention of writing, which hopefully you remember the year, is 3500 BC. Now, all the time before the invention of writing spans as far back as the Big Bang, which we know was billions of years ago. However, we do usually speak about prehistory being from the moment there were some anatomically accurate humans, more or less from Australopithecus time. That is still millions of years. So prehistory is millions and millions of years, whereas history is just, can anyone work out how many years is in history so far? I recommend you pause the video and look it up if you don't remember, or you can't figure it out. But history would be equal to about 5,500 years so far. I mean, I don't know how long we're going to live for, so I can't tell you how much more history will occupy. How did I work it out? Well, there's 3,500 years before Jesus Christ and more or less 2,000 years after Jesus Christ, which makes 5,500 years. Okay, another way for you to illustrate this in some sort of diagram or image would be to think of a clock or like a pie chart. This is called a pie chart. Again, you should use a compass to make a perfect circle, however I can't. And if we made our pie chart equal 1 day, if it was equal to 1 day, then prehistory would make up almost the entire day. It would be 23 hours and 59 minutes. And then history would only be, 1 minute long. And that's what our diagram would show. This black line here would be history. You know, I can't even draw it small enough. It's such a tiny amount of time. And all the rest would be prehistory. Now, you're young and creative and imaginative, so you could think of other ways of showing this information. Okay, but what actually happened in this time period of prehistory that we're looking at? Well, the evolution of humans. And we've seen some of our ancestors, okay, how we evolved and became Homo sapiens. So I'm going to put some pictures here and we're going to discuss them and decide which ancestor each picture is. So here, for example, we've got one picture. As you can see, this looks kind of like a chimpanzee, but it's walking on 2 feet. It's not using its hands to walk. Well, this is our first ancestor, and it's called Australopithecus. Try and remember now the 2 characteristics I've just said about Australopithecus. He looks like and he walks. Okay, he looks like a chimpanzee, and he walks on 2 feet. Which means the same thing as a biped, because bi is equal to 2 and ped is equal to foot. He was the first one. He lived from around 4 million, 5 million years before Christ until 1 million. And here, who do we have? I recommend you take out the worksheet that we've done in class called Our Ancestor. It has all the characteristics on it, and search for the information as you do this activity because it will help you to study. That document's also in iTunes U. You'll find it under the section called Our Ancestors. Well, here's a fellow and he's got 2 rocks in his hand, and what he's actually doing is making tools. And because he's making tools, I know he's Homo habilis, the first ancestor to make tools. It shouldn't be too hard for you to remember who it is and his name, because this part, habilis, is very similar to a Spanish word, habilidades, which means skills. So this is the man with skills because he could make basic stone tools. And I wonder now if anyone remembers the name of the type of stone he used. Not in Spanish, in English. If you know it in Spanish, go, don't be lazy and look it up in word reference. Because actually doing this will make you remember it rather than just listening to me say the word. Well, the answer anyway is flint. So here we are in the corner at the top with the 3rd ancestor, who is, fire should give you a clue. Look for it on the worksheet. Homo erectus. Yes, I'm sure you got that right. And his defining characteristic is that he discovered fire. He did not invent fire, no, because you can't invent it. He discovered it. And he came after Homo habilis. Homo erectus were also the first of our ancestors to actually leave Africa. Okay, we actually originated in Africa with Australopithecus and Homo habilis, but Homo erectus was the first to leave and explore other territories and went to Europe and Asia. So in a sense, he's our closest descendants as we're Europeans. So let's continue on. Here we have a lovely photo that I'm sure you'll love of 2 guys eating another one on the floor. It must be tasty. So you should hopefully know who this is. It's not quite It's not hard to forget because it's quite a disgusting thing to do. Well, this is Homo antecessor. He came after Homo erectus, and another interesting fact about them are that fossils of theirs were found in Atapuerca near Burgos in Spain. We're almost there. After Homo antecessor we have Neanderthal. And Neanderthals are known for this practice here, burying their dead. Now don't confuse this picture with Homo antecessor. Because they're similar, but you can see Homo antecessor is literally eating the meat, okay? So in the exam, pay close attention to the pictures. An interesting question to think about is actually why they bury their dead. Okay, so why don't you stop the video and think of a few reasons why they would do it? Why do we do it? I'll tell you some of the ideas. For example, if there's a dead body, after some time it's going to disintegrate and rot, which is disgusting. No one wants to see someone they care about, or even someone they don't care about, rotting. But also, when a body rots, it smells, so that's going to be horrible. And if you bury it, you don't have to suffer the smell. Another reason, if the body is rotting and smelly, it's going to attract insects and things like that, and also possibly wild animals, which means that these animals might come to your camp or your settlement, and it puts you in danger. So you need to bury the body. And the other interesting fact is that the burials we found are not just like bodies chucked or thrown into a hole. They actually have like markers or rocks or some sort of layout that show that it was kind of an important thing for them to do, which indicates they may have had religious or spiritual beliefs too. Okay, and lastly, here we have Homo sapiens. And from the picture, you should be able to tell what their main characteristic is. It's the invention of art. Apart from inventing art, they also had a more complex language, and they were responsible for learning how to plant crops, domesticate animals, because they became sedentary in the Neolithic period, which you should know is also called the New Stone Age. And yeah, they were more intelligent than all the other species. That's what we are. And so they came about in around 130,000 years before Christ, and we've continued living, and we don't know how long we'll live for. So this is probably the most complicated part. I really recommend you go over this part of the video with the images, look closely at the pictures, the characteristics, and also know the order of the ancestors before the test. And last but not least, we're going to go over very quickly the periods of the Stone Age. You have this information also in your notebooks and a timeline. And I'm just going to explain a little bit the connection between these periods and the ancestors that we have just seen. Well, firstly, we have a line showing time, and we can divide the prehistory into three main sections. We do this to make it easier as historians or academics who study history to discuss the events, if we're able to categorize them. So we have three periods. The first one is, you should be naming them now, the Paleolithic or the Old Stone Age. Hopefully you remember from the other video that paleo means old and lith means stone. That's where the name comes from. Well, this time period was from around 2.5 million until 8,000. So it would occupy the majority of the timeline, okay, from here to here. Actually, it would take up even more, but it's easier to show you so you can see more clearly if I stop it a bit earlier. So this is from 2.5 million. You have it in your notebook, hopefully, if you've been doing your classwork, until 8,000, and the whole timeline is BC. Okay? The next period is the Mesolithic period. It's an intermediate period between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. So it's like a transitionary period. And that goes from about 10,000 BC until 6,000. Now, I can't even, with my finger, make it small enough. It should be actually a lot closer to the red line. It's just very hard with my finger. This is Mesolithic. So 10,000 until 6,000 BC. And the other name for Mesolithic is the Middle Stone Age, because meso means middle and lith means stone. And finally we have the Neolithic Age. And the Neolithic Age is from 8,000 so the time that the Paleolithic age ends, until around 3,500. And my proportions are not great, just because it's very difficult to do it here, okay? So this is 8,000, the same year as Paleo, and ends in 3,500. Now, I want you to look very carefully, because this is very important for you to understand. Why do you think do these areas overlap? You can see that Paleolithic ends in the year 8,000, but Mesolithic begins in the year 10,000, which is before the end of the other period. This shows that it's not that one period ends and the next one begins, but depending on the place at that time, that decides what period of time it's in. I'll explain more clearly. Nowadays, we're in the year 2016, and in Spain, in our school, Highlands, we've got iPads in the classroom, okay? So we could say, or in the future, the historians could name this period exactly the technological age or the iPad age, for example. However, if we go to Africa, some isolated place in Africa or the Amazon jungle, and we find a tribe of people living there now in the year 2016, they do not have iPads. They don't even have running water in their houses. They're living a more prehistoric way of life, hunting and gathering. And therefore, although we and they all are living in the year 2016, the way that we're living is completely and utterly different. Well, that's what these periods mean. They're discussing the technological advances of the time. So perhaps in some part of Africa in the year 9,000 BC, they're living in a Paleolithic way, like hunting and gathering. But in Spain, perhaps in the year 9,000 BC, or what was Spain, they were a bit more advanced, and they were in the transitionary period of the Mesolithic. That is why the time periods overlap. And also some people jumped straight from Paleolithic to Neolithic. Okay, it just depended on the time, the place, the environment, many other factors. And the very last thing, because I know it's quite a long video, but it is covering all the stuff we've done in the whole term so far, are being able to categorize what events happened and what things were learned at what time period. We've done an activity like this in class, but just to recap, I'll do it now. So for example, in the Paleolithic age, the people lived nomadically, which means they were traveling from place to place. They didn't live in one place. Why? Because they were hunter-gatherers. They hunted animals for food, and they gathered or collected fruits, berries, nuts, things like that. Therefore, they have to follow the animals. The animals migrate depending on the changes in the seasons, so do the people, and that's why they're nomadic. It's also during this time period that all the ancestors lived. Okay, if you actually look at that worksheet, the dates will show you that all of them lived within the Paleolithic age. And so almost every single thing that they invented, discovered, or were capable of happened in the Paleolithic. For example, they buried their dead in the Paleolithic because that's Neanderthal. They had religious beliefs in the Paleolithic because we think Neanderthal buried their dead for religious reasons. They discovered fire in Paleolithic. They discovered art. The Homo sapiens discovered art in Paleolithic. They were able to communicate in Paleolithic. All of those things happen in the Old Stone Age. Then the big change is in the New Stone Age, where they become sedentary. So Homo sapiens are the only species to become sedentary as far as we know, and it happens in the Neolithic age, okay, because it's quite an advancement. What happened was that they learned how to domesticate their animals and grow crops, and for that reason they could not move places or didn't need to. If you have a pet dog and you travel around the world week by week and just leave your dog at home alone, it's going to die because no one's looking after it if you haven't asked someone to look after it. The same thing with the Homo sapiens. When they started domesticating the animals, it's much harder to have to move them around. Why would you want to anyway? And you can't abandon them. So they live in one place. So they became sedentary and had domestication of animals and planted crops. It's also in this time where they learned to cooperate socially better, which means helping one another, and made better, more advanced tools. The Mesolithic is just the transition period between these two things. So during Mesolithic, they were able to make some pottery, and they also might have improved their communication and made some better tools. Okay, that's the quickest recap I can do. I hope it's been helpful, clarified a lot of things, and good luck in your test. Don't stress, I'm sure you'll do fine. Thanks for listening.